Looks like I was interrupted. My recording quit at about the 14-minute mark. I don't know how seamlessly this will run together, but messages traveled at the speed of a messenger. More about that in a minute here. But a messenger arrived bringing Mr. Morse the news that his wife was very ill and was at the point of death. So he dropped his brushes and so forth and traveled as quickly as he could some distance to his home, only to find that he had arrived too late. Something needs to be done to fix this. Involved here, and what he did was work out a way to strengthen a signal. A telegraph signal could travel, a greater distance without degrading too much. It took him several years to work it out. He had an assistant who helped him by working out a code still known as the Morse code of dots and dashes. You're not supposed to call them dashes, but everybody does. And this was first demonstrated in 1844, I think it was. And he sent a message some distance with people there to witness and everything. And the first message sent by telegraph was symbolically, I guess, for ceremonial purposes, were the words, "What hath God wrought?" Okay. I mean, creating the universe isn't impressive. Making a telegraph key goes click. Wow. That struck me as odd. Okay. So, the first bit of hard news was that it's 1844, presidential election year. The news that the Democratic National Convention had selected an unexpected nominee, James K. Polk of Tennessee. He was a compromise candidate, and the people who received the message thought that couldn't be right. This consarn contraption don't work. But it did work. And telegraph lines spread quickly across the country. Railroad companies loved the telegraph because it enabled them much better to coordinate the movements of their trains and keep them running together. Okay? A train departs from Station A headed for Station B before the telegraph just on sheer faith that another train is not departing from Station B on the way to Station A. So it made train traffic quicker. It brought us instant communications, at least where the telegraph lines ran. And this had a huge impact on business and how quickly business could be conducted and orders placed. There was a charming little book I read a while back about the telegraph, calling it the 19th century's internet. And of course, the telegraph's usefulness is gone now. It's made way for much, much more advanced technologies, but this is a huge thing when it happened. One more little thing here about just the look of things. When neighbors visit from out of town and you're driving them around showing them the place you live, do you point with pride at the utility poles? No, they're eyesores. But if it were 175 years ago, you probably would. Telegraph poles carrying lines, they look very much like utility poles have looked ever since, and that was proof that you were up with the times. You were living in the 19th century. You have access to the telegraph. And before I leave it go, the messages ever since the world began had traveled no faster than a messenger who might be running, riding a horse or a wagon, or riding a relay of horses like the Pony Express riders. Hard news crossed the ocean at the speed of a sailing ship. So events of major significance could happen in Europe, and nobody in America would even hear about it for 3 weeks to a month. That's almost unimaginable. You're probably carrying on your person a device which would enable you to communicate with pretty much any other human being on the planet whose number you have in real time. Interesting. Okay. There were attempts fairly soon by the 1850s to lay telegraph cables across the ocean floor, connecting the United States with Europe. There was a businessman named Cyrus Field who pursued that, spent a lot of money on it, and in the late 1850s he managed to lay a successful cable, but for unknown reasons it went dead. Now think about this. You're going to need a really big ship. It's going to need to be a steamship so it can kind of go in a straight line. It's got all these huge, huge reels of cable. And when one reel runs out, you've got to have people that can quickly connect it to the end of the next reel. And if it breaks, okay, guys, I need a volunteer to dive down there and find that loose end. They actually had a way of doing that. I don't know what it was. The Civil War interrupted that experiment, but from 1866 on to the present day, we have had instant communication with Europe. Talk about the world changing. Telephones make their appearance in the mid-1870s. There were a number of different inventors working on this, some in competition with each other, and I wouldn't say the man who invented it first, but the man whose representative got to the patent office first on a day was a Canadian named Alexander Graham Bell. There was another inventor whose representative was not that far up in line on a given day. It's that close, so Bell gets the credit. But this was in the year 1876. And by the 1890s, telephones, they're crude, cumbersome, slow, and expensive to use, but there were telephones in corporate offices, the residences of the wealthy, and that sort of thing. You even had long distance calls, as they were known. They were way more expensive than such things are today. But that's in the 19th century. It must have seemed miraculous. Not only make a telegraph key go click, but to actually transmit voices. And some kind of innovation, fairly soon, both people could talk at the same time and hear each other. They could, decode it, two people talking at once. So the application of electricity to communication, these are very much world-changing events. The next thing up is how did the railroad system improve after the Civil War, say between 1865 when the Civil War ended and the end of the century? Well, there are a lot of things. To begin with, as of 1865, the U.S. had about 35,000 miles of track, more than all of Western Europe combined. It was not exactly the same track they'd had 5 years earlier, because while the war is going on, track is being destroyed in the South at about the same rate new track is being laid in the North. Now, it's not really a system, okay? Not all the dots on the map are connected. The railroad companies still use their own custom-made gauge. Gauge in railroading is how far apart the tracks are. And they didn't have a standard gauge. So that means that your trains won't run on my tracks, but my trains won't run on your tracks, because if you're having a good day and the Ritalin's working and sit there and kind of mellow out and scratch your head and stroke your chin and ponder, it might come to you that the wheels on the cars need to be exactly the same distance apart as the tracks. Got it? All right. So if you're a businessman planning to ship a cargo beyond the range of the local railroad company, you got to get the maps out and show where the railroad companies run and load up your train and take it as far as the local company goes, and then offload, truck the stuff across town, load it on the next company's train, go how far they goes. This might be to zigzag as you're moving your cargo from one railroad company to another. You're going to have shrinkage, leakage, breakage, and stealage, perhaps shrinkage. And even then, as cumbersome and clunky as that was, the cost of shipping freight had dropped dramatically, something down to like 5% of what it had been with horse-drawn freight wagons. Even like that. All right, things began to pick up after the Civil War. For one thing, a vast expansion in railroad track mileage. Okay, from 35,000 miles, give or take, in 1865. 25 years later, in 1890, it's up to something like 166,000 miles. That's an increase of several fold. The South, of course, is much better served. And as of 1865, you couldn't ride a train all the way across the United States. That project was ongoing during the Civil War, building the Transcontinental Railroad. You had two companies, one of them building southwest from, I'm not exactly sure, I'm going to say Chicago, but I think it was a more westerly point, and another company building northeast through the Rocky Mountains from San Francisco. They made much slower going. Um, and finally, the railroad companies, their tracks met in northern Utah, but they're both on cost plus contracts, which means it doesn't pay them to actually finish the job. And they met and built parallel tracks for like 30 miles. This doesn't look good. So they, connected the tracks together and had a ceremony out there with the two locomotives coming together and, exchanging champagne bottles or whatever it was, and crowds of people in the front. And it's photographs, one of our most famous photographs. And what you usually don't get told is that they had construction workers out there. Most of the ones who constructed the eastern part were Irish immigrants, and the ones from the west were Chinese. And so before they took the shot, remember you got a big old stationary view camera there, long exposure, it was decided that those Chinese workers who had suffered huge losses and accidents and stuff, they just didn't look American enough. So they were asked to get up and leave the frame. So they're not depicted. Way to go. Anyway, ceremonially, the last spike driven was a golden spike. Don't go looking for it. It's in a museum somewhere. But other than the odd demographics of the thing, it cut the travel time from halfway across the country already, from like Missouri to San Francisco. It cut the travel time from 6 months to 1 week. By 1890, there are several different transcontinental lines. You've got a railroad company running through Minnesota and the Dakotas and Montana out to the Pacific Northwest. You've got the original Transcontinental Railroad. You've got the Southern Pacific, I think it was, running along roughly the route of Interstate 10. Yes, and railroads were penetrating the Great Plains, as I told you, more and more every year. So greater mileage, more transcontinental routes, and a standard gauge. The railroad companies agreed upon a standard gauge, and it's odd sounding. The tracks are 4 feet, 8 1/2 inches wide, or apart. Okay, that happens to be just about as far apart as the wagons on a horse-drawn wagon. There you go, wheels on a horse-drawn wagon. I'll get it right eventually. And they happen to be about the same distance apart as the bowhinies of the two horses that are pulling it. Somebody posted this thing about how the solid fuel booster for the space shuttle was manufactured in Colorado by Morton Thiokol Company and had to travel by train to Cape Canaveral and go through tunnels. And the size was limited. It couldn't be too big to go through the tunnel. So the solid fuel boosters on the space shuttle was limited in size by how far apart the bowhinies were on 2 chariot horses. Dance it wrong. I'm not making this up. Okay. So the standard gauge. Now, as companies replace their locomotives and other railing stock, the companies that build these are very relieved just not to have all these custom-made sizes. Another thing, steel replaced iron. As of the Civil War, everything about a train that was made out of metal was made out of iron and wood and some glass, of course. Iron has problems here. Iron is brittle. Iron breaks. And so boilers could not take as much pressure because boiler plates are made out of iron. The rails are subject to breaking, especially in northern areas where they have what they call the freeze-thaw cycle. And so steel became available in much greater quantities at much lower prices. And as at the same time the steel industry is growing, steel and railroads grew together, because without railroads you couldn't have brought the raw materials together to make the steel. And then once the steel's being made, the railroad companies bought over half of it. We'll take this up in part 6.